Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, August 16th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel has killed over 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza. So Gaza's health ministry said Thursday that the number of Palestinians it has recorded killed by the Israeli onslaught has surpassed 40,000, or about 2% of the population. The number is considered a conservative estimate since it does not account for the 10,000 people who are missing and believed to be dead under the rubble. The health ministry said that a total of 40,005 Palestinians have been killed over 10 months, including 40 who were killed in the previous 24-hour period. So they put this out on Thursday. So from Wednesday into Thursday, they recorded 40 more Palestinians were killed. And the total number of wounded is 92,401. So the health ministry has identified 32,280 bodies by name. The rest of the bodies have not been identified. And this includes, out of that 32,000, 10,627 children, 5,956 women, and 2,770 elderly people. So that's already more than half there. And then, we're not going to assume that every Palestinian man who's killed is a member of Hamas. Of course, that can't be true. So it's the majority civilians, of course, not a surprise at all. Gaza's media office has estimated more than 16,000 children have been killed. So that's the number that they're putting out. It's unclear how many Palestinians have died due to indirect causes of the siege, such as food shortages, medicine shortages, the destruction of Gaza's health facilities, and the spread of disease. Gaza's media office has said at least 35 children have starved to death. A letter written by a group of experts that was recently published by The Lancet, the British medical journal, they estimated that the total number of deaths in Gaza, including those killed by the Israeli military and indirect causes, could reach 186,000. And that was based on the death toll from the end of June, which was just over 37,000. So they took that number and then did some math for indirect deaths and came to 186,000. And there's also a group of American doctors and nurses who volunteered in Gaza. They wrote a letter to President Biden last month, and they estimated that the actual death toll has already exceeded 92,000, or 4.2% of the population. The American medical professionals also detailed the horrific violence being committed by Israeli soldiers against children. This is the letter. Again, this is doctors and nurses, surgeons who volunteered in Gaza. They said every single one of them on a daily basis treated preteen children who were shot in the head. So there's no mistake about that you're killing a child if you're shooting them in the head. And also, I don't want to, dropping bombs on them from the sky is just as evil as shooting them in the head. But the U.S. continues to support this genocidal war. We see all this, nothing's changing. We see the U.S. claim that they care about these civilian casualties, but that it's clear that they don't. We just saw this week the State Department approved $20 billion in weapons sales for Israel, including F-15s that could drop more bombs on Palestinians in the future, tank ammunition, so things that they will be able to use to continue killing Palestinians. A lot of that's not going to be delivered for a few years, but apparently the tank ammunition might get sent over pretty quickly. All right, so a grim milestone for Gaza. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. says that Israel bombing Gaza will kill civilians but not defeat Hamas. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. U.S. intelligence officials speaking with the New York Times said that Israel will not be able to defeat Hamas, and continuing to bomb Gaza will only kill more civilians. So some national security officials expressed surprise at how much Israel has degraded Hamas over the 10-month onslaught, but acknowledged that the Israeli Defense Forces cannot prevent the Palestinian group's reorganization. So this New York Times report said, quote, Israel has achieved all that it can militarily in Gaza, according to senior American officials who say continued bombings are only increasing risks to civilians, end quote. So they're saying that there is little more that Israel can accomplish against Hamas. So here you have U.S. officials saying, they're saying that Israel's like at the end of the line with Hamas, that they can't do more damage to them. So, they're saying that they're just going to keep killing civilians. That's all this is going to do. And yet the U.S. continues to send weapons and bombs for this. And this is something that U.S. officials are thinking and talking about. That means that the administration knows very well that all that is going to come of this continued military support is more slaughter, is more destruction, and more death. All right, so the next one here, journalists tell Blinken to stop weapons transfers to Israel. So antiwar.com has joined 19 other news outlets, 7 press freedom organizations, and 113 journalists in a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for the U.S. to end weapons transfers to Israel to stop supporting the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. This letter was initiated by the Courage Foundation, Defending Rights and Dissent, and Roots Action, and it focuses on the Israeli targeting of journalists in Gaza. The letter reads, quote, since October 7th, 2023, Israel has killed more than 160 Palestinian journalists. This is the largest recorded number of journalists killed in any war. While Israel's indiscriminate bombing of the densely populated Gaza means no civilians are safe, Israel has also been repeatedly documented deliberately targeting journalists, end quote. The letter notes the mass killing in Gaza would not be possible without U.S. weapons and support. It says, quote, Israel's military actions are not possible without U.S. weapons, U.S. military aid, and U.S. diplomatic support. By providing the weapons being used to deliberately kill journalists, you are complicit in one of the gravest affronts to press freedom today, end quote. So besides targeting journalists with bombs, the Israeli government has also cracked down on the press in other ways, including by shutting down Al Jazeera in Israel. The letter says, quote, Israel has gone to great lengths to suppress media coverage of its war in Gaza, imposing military censorship on both its own journalists and international reporters operating in the country, and with Egypt's help, blocking all foreign journalists from Gaza. Israel shut down Al Jazeera, raided its office, seized its equipment, and blocked its broadcasts and website within Israel, end quote. It's another thing is that they haven't let foreign journalists in Gaza. That's why the doctors and surgeons that volunteer there end up being the ones that, are kind of the journalists, because you don't have any other foreigners going in there. The letter points to U.S. foreign assistance laws that prohibit military aid to countries credibly accused of human rights violations. It says, quote, Israel's well-documented pattern of extrajudicial executions of journalists is a gross violation of human rights, end quote. So the letter concludes by urging an immediate halt to U.S. military support for Israel. It says, quote, the U.S. is providing the weapons Israel continually uses to target Palestinian journalists in Gaza. This is a violation of international law and U.S. domestic law. We urge you to immediately cease the transfer of all weapons to Israel, end quote. So Blinken, he's the one, it's his State Department that just approved that $20 billion big missile sale, and then not missile sale, there's planes and tank munition and a few other things. There were some missiles in there. And then a few days before that, they released $3.5 billion in the State Department foreign military financing that came out of that $17 billion that they approved for Israel. Someone emailed me asking if I knew the total that the U.S. has spent on this since October 7th. And it's kind of tricky to actually figure out. So one thing that is confusing, this happens with Ukraine too. So back in April, Biden signed a $95 billion foreign military aid bill into law, and that included $17 billion for Israel. But that hasn't all been, that doesn't mean that $17 billion has been spent. So when you see things on Friday, like the $3.5 billion that they released, that means that they're spending that, they're taking that from that $17 billion. So you could say with the $17 billion and with the $3.5 billion that Israel gets each year, in 10 months, I think it's safe to say that they've authorized $20 billion in spending to support this. You could also factor in the few billion that they've cost fighting the Houthis and in other regional escalations. And then I think they haven't been transparent. So it's possible that they've been spending other money that we don't know. But I think, a conservative estimate of what the U.S. has spent on this in the past 10 months is maybe somewhere around $23 billion. And again, that's including the $17 billion, which they still haven't technically spent all of that yet, but it will be spent. They have those funds there. And I'm sure that there's other ways that they're spending money on this that some people listening to this might think of. So let me know what you think. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu denies report that he spoke to Trump about Gaza talks. So this is, so yesterday I had that story from Axios that said Trump spoke with Netanyahu ahead of the hostage deal talks. But Netanyahu denied that on Thursday, said that he had not spoken with President Trump. A statement from his office said, quote, contrary to media reports, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did not speak yesterday with former President Donald Trump, end quote. So who knows what the story is there. You certainly don't just trust Netanyahu, but we also didn't see any confirmation of the call from Trump's side. All right, so the next one here, Biden, Mulls giving Ukraine long-range missiles. So a lot of big escalations when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening inside Russia now. So Politico reported on Thursday that the Biden administration is open to sending Ukraine long-range air-to-surface cruise missiles amid Ukraine's offensive in Russia's Kursk Oblast. So these missiles that they're considering sending are the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, or JASSMs. They have a range of over 230 miles. That would make them the longest range weapon that the U.S. will send Ukraine if they end up going ahead and giving them these missiles. They probably will. This is usually how it starts. We hear that they're thinking about it, and then they eventually do it. Sources told Politico that no final decision has been made as the Pentagon is trying to figure out if Ukraine's Soviet-era fighter jets could carry these missiles. They weigh 2,400 pounds and have a 1,000-pound warhead, so very heavy bomb that they have there. Ukraine has received a small number of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets, and they are capable of carrying these missiles. But we don't really know what the situation is there. I mean, I think they've only gotten like 6 planes, and they only have 6 pilots that can fly them, but they need to go in teams of 2. So that means only 3 planes could be operational, and there's no sign that they're using them yet. So I don't know. But I think if they could use these with their Soviet planes, then we would probably see this missile shipment happen. And I get into some stuff on Kursk here, but we have more on that in the next story here. So the next one, British tanks are being used by Ukrainian forces inside Russia. Ukrainian troops have been using British Challenger 2 tanks inside Russia as part of the offensive in the Kursk Oblast. This was reported by Sky News on Thursday, and this report came a day after the British Defense Ministry confirmed that Ukraine was allowed to use British weapons inside the Russian mainland. Former British Defense Minister Ben Wallace said that he gave Ukraine permission to use British-provided weapons inside Ukraine during his time in office, and he left last year. He said that the only exception for the rule was for the Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of about 155 miles. But that's Wallace. He's a former official, so maybe the UK has given them the green light to use the Storm Shadow missiles. And the use of British and other NATO-provided weapons inside Ukraine, of course, risks response from Russia. This is a huge escalation. And earlier this year, if you remember, this was not that long ago, Moscow warned that Russian forces could target British military installations in response to British weapons being used in attacks on Russian territory. So Russia warned them directly. They summoned the ambassador in Moscow and said, if British weapons are used on our territory, and we're talking about the Russian mainland here because they have been used in Crimea, if they're used inside the Russian mainland, we will strike British military sites. And there is a small number of British troops in Ukraine, probably just like a few dozen, helping them fire those Storm Shadow missiles. So maybe that's what Russia is referring to. But they also said, I'll read the quote. This is what the Russian Foreign Ministry said in May. Quote, any British military facilities and equipment on the territory of Ukraine and beyond could be a response to Ukrainian strikes with the use of British weapons on the territory of Russia, end quote. So any British military facilities on the territory of Ukraine and beyond could be targets. And the U.S. is also allowing Ukraine to use its weapons in the Kursk offensive. President Biden gave Ukraine the green light to strike Russian territory with U.S. weapons at the end of May, following Russia's assault on Kharkiv. The U.S. maintains that Ukraine cannot use weapons for long-range strikes, but it has not defined a limit, and they are asking for all restrictions to be lifted. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky, claimed on Thursday that Ukrainian forces had penetrated 21 miles into Russian territory. If you look at the map here from South Front, in some areas here it says that Russia is repelling the Ukrainian attacks, and it looks like they're pushing them back, just based on South Front's map. But then if you look over here in the east, this is in Kursk, the Ukrainian forces are captured a few villages over here. So the fight is certainly not over. And then if you see the map, there's kind of this long area. You know, they went into Kursk and took territory kind of evenly. Then there was one little area where they broke through beyond where most of the fighting was happening, but it looks like they're being pushed back from there. But still, I mean, this is an invasion of Russia that's being backed by the U.S. and NATO. It's just, the U.S. and Russia have never been this close to a direct war, to nuclear war. And, it seems like barely anybody's paying attention to it, I guess, because of the election. And people are also just used to the war in Ukraine, kind of numb to it. It's just something that's been going on now for over 2 years. So people are just not concerned about it. They think, we're not going to go to war with Russia. But this thing just keeps escalating, just keeps going and going. And all the rules that they had, that they wouldn't send planes, that they wouldn't give them tanks. I mean, at one point, NATO said, no, we're not going to give you tanks. Now there's NATO tanks inside Russia. So you just see how this thing has escalated. All right, so the next story here. A report says that Zelensky initially approved the Nord Stream bombing. So the Wall Street Journal published this big story on Thursday that alleges Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky initially approved the plan to bomb the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines, which connect Russia and Germany. The report said Zelensky called off the plan after the CIA warned him not to do it. So the CIA swooped in and said, don't do this. And Zelensky apparently called it off. But then Zaluzhny, who is the Ukrainian commander-in-chief at the time, now he's the Ukrainian ambassador to London. Zaluzhny went ahead and did it anyway. He went rogue, and they blew up the pipelines. So in response to this report and Germany issuing an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian over the blasts, Russia is suggesting that Western countries are trying to shift the blame here. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said, quote, the West's key task is to absolve itself of any responsibility for sabotaging the Nord Streams, end quote. So Russia has previously blamed the U.S. and its allies for the attack on the pipeline. And we had that Seymour Hersh report from last year. He said Biden ordered the bombing and that U.S. Navy divers planted explosives on the pipeline in June 2022. Then it was detonated in September 2022. The U.S. also had the motive for the attack. They've been trying to stop Nord Stream 2 with sanctions. Biden and Nuland were threatening the pipeline. But Hersh's report has not been confirmed by other sources. And since it was published, it was after Hersh published that we started seeing these stories shifting the blame to Ukraine. So maybe there is something to that this, I don't know what to make of all this. It's tough to believe this is now the official story, is that 6 Ukrainians rented a yacht and did this. That's the official story. 4 of them were professional divers. So that's what they're going with. It's a story that I find pretty hard to believe. It just seems like an operation that would have to be more complicated than that. And it also says that this plot was thought up in May 2022 by a group of Ukrainian officials and businessmen during a night of drinking. Said that they were like drunk and came up with this plan, and then they did it. So, I don't know. Maybe more will come out. Maybe we'll see what Hersh says in response to all this, what his sources tell him. But it's either way, it goes from, because we saw pundits and some Western officials initially blaming this on Russia, and now the official story is that it was Ukraine, the country that Germany, because this is German pipeline, this is German energy infrastructure. It was the largest release of methane gas, I think, ever. It was a huge, environmental problem, and just a very big attack on energy infrastructure in Europe. And it wasn't the Russians, it was the Ukrainians, or it was possibly the U.S. And so there's an interesting quote here from a German official. They say now that the German investigation is all focused on Zelensky. They've absolved Zelensky, I guess. And it is notable, Zelensky is considered like a political rival of Zelensky. If there is ever a Ukrainian presidential election, he is kind of expected to throw his hat into the ring, and polls show that he's more popular. So maybe this is a way they could take him down. So a German official said, quote, "An attack of this scale is a sufficient reason to trigger the collective defense clause of NATO, but our critical infrastructure was blown up by a country that we support with massive weapons shipments and billions in cash," end quote. A senior Russian diplomat in Berlin dismissed the German investigation, calling it a fairy tale. And then, so in response to this Wall Street Journal report, Ukraine is denying that it had anything to do with this. Mikhailo Podolyak, he's an aide to Zelensky. He said, quote, "Such an act can only be carried out with the extensive technical and financial resources. And who possessed all this at the time of the bombing? Only Russia," end quote. So still blaming Russia, even though it just makes no sense for Russia. These Nord Stream pipelines were a big leverage over Germany. They could have maybe, used them to convince Germany not to go all in on this proxy war. But, so blowing them up would take that away. Of course, there's a lot of reasons, and Ukraine's not going to blame the U.S., so they're trying to still blame it on Russia. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 2 and wound 25 in Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. Israeli forces carried out multiple strikes against southern Lebanon on Wednesday, killing at least 2 people, wounding over 25 across the region. The slain have yet to be identified. So again, several towns here, and in one of these strikes, it's not clear if they killed civilians or Hezbollah. These strikes were in civilian areas. One occurred near local shops, and in one strike, one of the wounded was an 8-year-old girl, and then in another one, a 10-year-old boy was wounded as well. So the strikes across the border continue. The next one here, Iran says that an IRGC officer dies of wounds sustained in U.S. strike in Syria. So this is kind of concerning. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, said Thursday that one of its officers died due to wounds that were sustained in a strike launched by the U.S.-led coalition in Syria. So Major General Hossein Salami commander of the IRGC, said in a statement that Colonel Ahmadreza Afshari, who was in the IRGC's aerospace division, was wounded in Syria while working as an advisor in the country. It's unclear exactly when the airstrikes took place. According to Iran's Press TV, Ashfari was hit sometime between July 22nd and August 5th. So it's kind of strange that it's this big range. I guess they don't know exactly when he was hurt. I don't know. And he was transferred to Iran for medical treatment, but he succumbed to his wounds and died. So the U.S. does have a history, so these IRGC advisors are a lot of times with the Shia militias that the U.S. targets. So it's always a risk, killing an Iranian could lead to another escalation. Now, in this time period, there's not any U.S. airstrikes that were officially, claimed by the U.S. in eastern Syria, where these militias usually operate, where the U.S. usually targets when they bomb Syria. But that doesn't mean that this wasn't the U.S. It's not clear. The U.S., it looks like, has been giving air support to the Kurds against the Arab tribes that they've been fighting. They've also been involved in fights against ISIS, and that involves airstrikes, and they don't report all those things. And it's also possible that it was Israel. Israel bombs Syria all the time, and they never take, they keep quiet about it. So we don't know exactly what happened here, but Iran is saying that it was U.S.-led. They say the U.S.-led coalition strike. So, another thing that could potentially lead to escalation here. All right, so the next one, the last story here, the Pentagon defies order to clean up forever chemicals. This article is from Responsible Statecraft from Nick Cleveland Stout. So the Department of Defense has been asked to clean up this fire suppressant called AFFF, which is contaminating the drinking water of millions of Americans. And the Department of Defense is refusing to take accountability. This week, the Air Force claimed that it had no legal obligation to comply with an order from the Environmental Protection Agency in May to abate the threat of forever chemicals to the drinking water of Tucson, Arizona. The EPA order required the Air Force to create a system designed to treat the high levels of these substances that are that they've been using and putting into the environment. They're linked to weakened immunity and other health risks, and the cost at cleaning it up is estimated to be about $25 million. Testing at the Tucson International Airport Area Superfund site has revealed that the levels of these chemicals are up to 5,300 times beyond the drinkable limit, which is likely to enter the Tucson public water system, according to the EPA. These chemicals likely originated from the use of this fire suppressant at airports and military sites. So the Pentagon saying, not our problem. We don't have to clean it up. But we see a lot of this with the Pentagon, with the military around the country, damaging the environment and here they just don't even want to take the steps to remedy it. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Raiho Taikuchi. The U.S. and Japanese forces are integrated and prepared for war, or they prepare for war, I should say. One from Ramsey Baroud, Restoring Fear, Why Israeli Soldiers Rape. One from Joseph Solis Mullen, The Taiwan Problem You Probably Don't Know. One from Arab Sobsak, Israelis Using Gaza Civilians as Human Shields. And one from Haaretz, Israeli Settler Violence is Not the Exception, It is the Rule. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. We have stuff over there. Reminder, that Ron Paul Institute event is coming up. It's August 31st in D.C., so if you can go to that, the link is in the description. That's it for the week. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe. All that stuff helps out. Follow me on Twitter. Follow antiwar.com there. Follow antiwar.com on Instagram, also on Facebook. I never go on Facebook these days, but we are on there. But anyway, that is it for me for the week. I will be back in a few days. Thanks for listening.